Hi everyone! For our adult maker activity today, we are going to try Batik, which is a wax-resist dyeing process. This process is native to Indonesia, and people also use this process for handicrafts in India and Malaysia and other countries. So the materials you would need for this project are cotton fabric, some dye, this is natural dye. You'll need water, you'll need a brush, you will need either vinegar, rock salt, or citric acid, and I have included citric acid in your maker kit. You'll need wax. You can use tongs or gloves to protect your hands. I think gloves will probably work better. You will need an iron, and you'll need a microwave and a stove, or if you just have a stove, that's fine as well. You can use a double boiler to melt the wax. You'll need some paper. I have some white computer paper here, or you can also use the parchment paper that I included in the maker kit. And you might want a pattern to trace or a design to trace, and I'm going to trace this fish design right here. So the first step is to pre-wash your fabric and then let it dry and iron it and just set it aside. So I've given you a rather large piece of fabric in your maker kit, and for this tutorial, however, I'm going to use a smaller piece of fabric, and you're welcome to cut your fabric up if you like to smaller pieces. And essentially the process is to melt the wax and make a design on your fabric with the melted wax and dye your fabric, and then we're left with a nice design when you take the wax off. So now I'm going to boil water and add in the dye and citric acid. So I've about 3 cups of water in this pot, and I'm going to add in about a tablespoon and a half of dye. You can add in a little bit more as well, and I'm going to add in citric acid to help keep the dye from bleeding. So even though you're adding something in to keep the fabric from bleeding, I would make sure not to wash your batik piece with anything else if you're going to wash it. It's probably going to bleed somewhat for the next several washes, so I would just be careful. So I have melted my wax in the ceramic cup, and it took me about 2.5 minutes to melt the whole thing. I'll keep that aside. And I've also boiled my dye, added in the dye while the water was boiling, and also the citric acid while the water was boiling. And now I need to cool this dye bath, and I'm going to put it in the fridge. So we're going to add a wax design to fabric, and once we put that fabric in the dye, we don't want the dye to be hot because it'll melt the wax. So I'm going to go and put this in the fridge so that the dye cools down quicker. So at this point, I can add wax to the fabric so I can make a design with the wax. I've put down some paper so that it absorbs some of the wax when I apply it to the fabric. I'm going to put my design on, and again, you can do this freehand if you like. And then I'm going to put my fabric on top. So you can see through the fabric, you can see the design. And then I just take my melted wax and brush, and I start painting. trace this fish drying wax. Just make sure you don't get wax on any other part of the fabric, or if you do, I suppose you could just melt that part off. It's probably easier to see it lift it up, but you can see that I've traced my fish with the melted wax, and it's pretty thick, the wax is. I've also added some freehand design in the bottom, some dots as well. Now I'm just going to add the fabric to the dye, and I'm just going to scrunch it up and put it in water first. Make sure that the wax is completely dry before you do this. Then I'm going to add it to my dye right here, which is nice and cool. See. The dye did coagulate a little bit in the fridge, interestingly. I'm going to try and open up the fabric inside the pot to make sure that the dye gets to every part of the fabric. And I'm going to let it stay in there for a few minutes. So I'm just checking on my Batik, and I really like this effect. If you can, see, I'm going to try and show you, if you can see this crackling effect in the wax, that's exactly what you're supposed to get with this technique. You're breaking the wax a little bit so that some of the dye seeps into the cracks, and you can do that by hand too. You can break some of the wax and make cracks and get more of the dye in. But anyway, that's what you're supposed to get with this technique. So I'm quite happy with it. So I rinsed the fabric in room temperature water, and I've laid it out flat to dry, and this is what the piece looks like. A lot of the color actually brown, but I still like the shade of orange. If you want it darker, you can try to keep the cloth soaked in the dye for longer. Maybe that would help, or add more dye to it. That might help as well. So at this point, we're at the last step of the Batik process, and that step is to take the wax off the fabric. And you can use a couple of methods for this. You can either use an iron, or you can just use hot water to melt the wax off. So if you're using an iron, just make sure you put some paper down underneath your piece, put the piece on top, and paper on top of that. And then I'm going to use the parchment paper to protect my iron, and I'm going to heat up the iron and just go over the fabric with the iron, and as you can see, the wax is melting. And just take the wax off like that. You can flip the paper over, and again, go over your piece with the iron and take more of that wax off. As you can see, it's coming off. You'll have to do this several times. You can also use newsprint if you like, instead of white computer printing paper. I would not use newspaper because you might get ink. You might heat up the ink and get it on your Batik piece. As you can see, the wax is melting little by little, and it should come off, but it takes a while to do this way. So the other thing you can do is just put your piece in hot water. So this is what my piece looks like so far, using the ironing method. And I quite like this. I think I still have a little more to do on this, but I'm also going to try out the hot water method. And I'm going to see now if I can get the rest of the wax off using hot water. So I'm just dipping my fabric in hot water in a bowl. Some of the dye has come out and off. There. So this is my finished Batik piece. I really like it. I like the crackles in the design, or the cracks in the design. I do wish that the color were darker. I think it faded out a little bit, and I do wish that my lines were thicker, but I still quite like this piece, and I had fun making it, and I hope you had fun trying Batik.